not as he thought it should be, but the next day he'd give him a huge gift. He was volatile, etc. He was ruthless, he was tough, but he also had a very, very big heart, in my opinion. But you see, I'm seeing him from my vantage point. Whether others who knew him in a different way felt that way, I don't know.
What happened to him then? Because one tends to think, I guess, of his latter days as president, and the last words that come to mind would be handsome, vigorous, decisive, even ruthless. One thinks of him as being sort of sad and an almost melancholy figure.
Well, he did become sad and melancholy. He was broken. I think you go through several phases here. First, you have the Johnson of the Senate days. And then there was no one that was his equal. And I don't think there will be anyone who will be his equal. Let me say, one who has the makings of being as effective as Howard Baker, who unfortunately is not going to be leader in the Senate now since he's not running again. But Baker didn't have the ruthless quality that Johnson had. Johnson was not only persuasive, but he liked power and he used it. When he became president, for example, he would get all of the FBI reports that he possibly could on the various senators, and he'd look them right in the eye and let them know in no uncertain terms that he knew what they were up to. I mean, in their extracurricular activities. So he used power effectively, and if he couldn't win them by persuasion, he scared them to death. Or he rewarded them. He rewarded, he punished, he cajoled, he did it all. That was the Senate days. Then he became vice president. Those were very unhappy days for him. Unhappy because he felt from the beginning that he was superior to Kennedy, that he should have been in the office himself. He was a loyal vice president, however. He never cut Kennedy up while he was vice president, but it wasn't reciprocated. Kennedy, the president, did not cut him up, but Bobby really did him in, always putting out little stories about things, gaffes that he presumably had made. Edgar Hoover, who of course was very close to Johnson, told me on one occasion that in that period that Johnson was about ready to resign as vice president because Kennedy in a National Security Council meeting had berated him and humiliated him right in front of the president. And I would say that in that particular respect, that Johnson, I think, liked Jack Kennedy up to a point. He did not respect him as a leader because he thought Johnson, was a more effective leader. He hated Bobby Kennedy. And so it was an unhappy time. But, you know, Johnson gave him a little ammunition. He was fine in the domestic field where he was so effective that the Johnson Library has example after example where Jackie Kennedy writes memoranda to Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, to ask him to get things done that she thinks need to be done, rather than the president. And that shows you that she knew the man that could get things done. But in the foreign field, he was quite inept then, and later he improved some. But for example, I think one of his major gaffes, it didn't get a lot of play at the time, but it must have had quite an effect in certain quarters. A distinguished diplomat from India came in, and Johnson was talking to him. He said, you know, hell, we don't worship cows here in this country, we eat them. Well, you can imagine the effect you had on some Indian vegetarian who worshipped cows. But nevertheless, that was Johnson. Then came the period when he became president. And there for a time, he put on an act you wouldn't believe. He went to that grave about once a week. He'd find a reason to lay some flowers. He was contrite. He was humble. He was the man, the soft-spoken, a very kind man who had taken the mantle of leadership from the martyred president. He always spoke of what he was doing in terms of carrying out President Kennedy's policies rather than in terms of being president himself. And that was a period when he got a very, very good press, because the press basically was pro-Kennedy. One, because they considered him to be one of their own, sort of an intellectual. Two, they considered him to be basically, as he was, of course, a domestic liberal. And three, because he was a Democrat, of course. So anyway, here came Johnson in this period after Kennedy's assassination. And then a change had to come over him. He had won in his own right. He had won the biggest landslide in history. The only one that even approached it was the one that we won. By 0.1% less than that, we won in 1972 over McGovern.
This was his the Goldwater race in '64.
Goldwater race in '64. And so after massacring Goldwater, he proceeded, without realizing it, to massacre himself. Not at first. Johnson's first year after he was elected, year 1965, was a year of achievement even exceeding Franklin D. Roosevelt's famous 100 Days. The way he rolled that legislation through, the Great Society legislation. A lot of it was bad, in my opinion, but he got it through. And he's got to get a lot of credit for that. What he did then, he's got to get a lot of credit for having the ability to do it. Now, it's true that he had enormous majorities in both the House and the Senate, something Eisenhower didn't have when he had both houses, something Reagan does not have, something I never had. But you got to give him credit. He did it. In that period, his approval rating went up, but then Johnson began to be Johnson. And then people began to realize, now we've got this Johnson sitting in Kennedy's chair. And who is this meathead, this cornpone sitting in Kennedy's chair? You know, I speak of bigness. I'll never forget the first time I was in the Oval Office with Johnson. This is after I was elected president in 1968. I had been in the Oval Office with Kennedy. That was the only other time, 8 years before. And Kennedy sat in his rocking chair. Believe it or not, I was so surprised. I go into the Oval Office. Here Johnson's sitting in a rocking chair. The difference was it was twice as big as Kennedy's. That's Lyndon Johnson. So anyway, here was Johnson, and he was a very effective president, but then he began to turn off the pro-Kennedy people. And as a result, the situation began to change. It changed for several reasons. One, he broke it off in Bobby Kennedy by not taking him for vice president and, in effect, humiliating him, according to Bobby felt he had at least.
Would Bobby Kennedy have wanted to be vice president?
Oh, no question about it.
Wouldn't that have put him in a weak position vis-a-vis Johnson, like Johnson was in vis-a-vis John Kennedy?
Johnson, whatever people may say about his weaknesses, was a party man. For example, I remember Bobby Baker, who was his top assistant, telling me in 1960, Johnson, this is when Johnson was running against Kennedy for the nomination, Johnson will never go in that ticket, never go in that ticket. He despises this whippersnapper, et cetera. I wasn't a bit surprised when Johnson went in the ticket. He's a party man. And Johnson was a good vice president because he was a party man. He felt that was his job. On the other hand, Bobby Kennedy is a Bobby Kennedy man first, or a Kennedy man first, and a partisan Democrat second. And he would have done what was necessary. And the way he would do it would be very cleverly. He'd just have Johnson cut up through the media, through his leaks and his controls also, and all of his contacts out in the bureaucracy. And it would have been it would have been terrible for Johnson. It would have been a terrible mistake for him to let Bobby Kennedy be vice president.
Don't you, there's a story that you've told about the meeting at which Johnson broke the news to Bobby Kennedy that he wasn't going to be taken on the ticket.
Well, it's too bad that we don't have a record of that, but it's no fault of Lyndon Johnson's that we don't. What happened was that Johnson wanted to record the meeting. He had a very, very extensive recording system, and so taping system. He had everything taped. He even had a taping system under the bed in the White House. I don't know why, but he did. But he had meetings in his bedroom, so that didn't make any difference. I don't know whether he had any in the bathroom, but you know, sometimes Johnson, who loved to sometimes embarrass some whippersnapper or somebody who thought he was pretty smart from the East, he'd receive them while he's sitting on the toilet. He just loved to do that sort of thing. But in any event, in this case, he had the recording equipment, and he had this meeting, and I understand it was brutal, where Johnson told Kennedy, look, you're not going to be the vice presidential candidate. I want you to shape up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, he gave Bobby back in spades what Bobby had been given him when Bobby was Attorney General, and so forth. And so right after the meeting, Johnson called in his secretary and says, run off that tape. He used to transcribe the tapes. He loved to read his tapes after they were done. I never had any of them transcribed until after the taping system was revealed, so I didn't know what was on them. But in any event, the poor secretary came back. She says, "I can't do it. It's garbled." And he practically tore the roof off the Oval Office. He raised hell around there. He said, "What's happened here?" And what had happened was that Bobby is smart enough to know that Johnson was taping, and he apparently had carried a scrambler in his pocket. He'd scrambled the tape. So anyway, that's one of those stories that still exists in the White House legends. It tells us something about each.
I interrupted you. You were talking about the things that happened to Johnson, and one of them was that he didn't take Bobby
He didn't take
Kennedy
Bobby.
for
The
vice
second
president.
was the war. That put the nail in the coffin. You see, Johnson had to be a favorite. He wasn't a favorite of the Eastern establishment press, which is the most powerful press. He wasn't their favorite in terms of his Texas background. They thought he was basically a bit on the crude side, sort of a corn pone and so forth.
Wasn't he, in fact?
Yeah, he was a very down-to-earth fellow. I liked him, though. I mean, I don't believe that somebody has to speak with a so-called British accent and all that sort of thing. You know, that sappy accent that many of our foreign service people put on. You know, where they sort of burp out their words in order to prove that they are so smart. No, Johnson was what he was. And one thing, incidentally, before I get to that always used to me about Johnson. Johnson used to love to sort of stick it to, after he became president in his own right, to some of these, what he called fancy Dan bureaucrats, or from the State Department or some of the other agencies, and from the press, by deliberately using very bad grammar. Now, Johnson knew good grammar. He wasn't that badly educated. He knew it, but he used very bad grammar. He'd mispronounce things like that. Rather than saying hors d'oeuvre, he'd say hors d'oeuvre, and then he'd watch him cringe. But you know, that was not an unusual trait sometimes for people from the Midwest and the others who have a resentment toward these people that wear their education on their sleeves. I remember Bill Jenner. He was the senator from Indiana, very conservative, ultra-conservative. But he had been first in his class at Indiana Law School. He had a marvelous understanding of the English language, but he deliberately would use bad grammar on occasion. I recall the day that Averell Harriman announced he was going to run for president of the United States in 1956. Several of the senators were sitting with me. I was vice president at the time, in a little special dining room we have for members of the Senate there as stags, having lunch. And just as we were finishing, in came Bill Jenner. And he sort of slouched down into a chair and sat down. He said, "I just seen Harriman on the TV." And somebody said, "Well, what was he like, Bill? What do you think of him?" He says, "He's thin, boys. Thin as piss on a rock." Well, at any event, that was Bill Jenner. That was Lyndon Johnson. It turned some people off, but that's the way they were. And I kind of admired them for being what they were. But then, getting on, you add the Bobby Kennedy, not taking him, you add the war, you add the Texas style, all of those things did him in. But he deserved credit from that same group, we should say, however, for the Great Society program, which was more liberal and more costly than the New Deal, the Fair Deal, and the New Frontier put together. So they had to be for that on the issue. And also, I must say this, whatever anybody wants to say about Lyndon Johnson, he did one thing which no one else could have done at that time. Johnson carried out what Kennedy promised and was unable to carry out. That was particularly in the field of civil rights. He got through the famous and justly famous Civil Rights Act of 1964. He got it through, and only he, as a Southerner, could do it, stop the filibuster and all that sort of thing. He was able to do there, in the same way, what I was able to do going to China. I could go to China. Hubert Humphrey, a liberal, could not. Lyndon Johnson could do this as a Southerner. Kennedy, the Northerner, could not do. And those who believe in civil rights as I do owe him a great debt for biting the bullet then, bringing the South, frankly, back into the Union. That's what he did.
It's been written that whereas the Kennedys required loyalty of their staff and their followers out of confidence, Johnson required loyalty out of insecurity. Did you see that side of him?
No, I think that's, frankly, pro-Kennedy historians writing. No, Johnson was not insecure. That's just baloney. All this business about this one being secure and the other being insecure. There was no more self-confident man in the world than Lyndon Johnson. When he looked around him, for example, at these, what he called the Eastern establishment types and so forth, it wasn't a question of his feeling inferior. He felt he was superior to them. Have you ever found anybody from Texas that didn't think Texas was the biggest and the best, and that a Texan was the biggest and the best? They believed that, and he believed it in spades. The point was, and the mistake he made was this: the biggest mistake Lyndon Johnson made after he was elected in 1964 was not to become Lyndon Johnson. You know, these days, some of Reagan's conservative critics said, let Reagan be Reagan. Somebody should have said to Lyndon Johnson, let Johnson be Johnson. The real Lyndon Johnson would never have temporized with that war in Vietnam. He would not have escalated gradually. He would have moved in, and we would not have had the war as an issue. He would have ended it and ended it effectively. But Lyndon Johnson was passionately concerned about being liked. He was passionately concerned also about trying to win the Eastern establishment people. Not that he felt inferior, but he was confident enough that he thought that, well, by golly, I am really better than this other fellow. I can do things that he didn't do. I should be able to win them. And of course he couldn't win them because he was not their kind. He turned them off. Style is so important to those people. That's their bread and butter. And they're suckers for style, and Lyndon Johnson just didn't have it.
What you've said that he said that without J. Edgar Hoover, he couldn't have been president. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I know very well what he meant. He meant that in this period when we were at a war and when the place was plagued with leaks, that J. Edgar Hoover was indispensable to him. I'm confident that's what he meant. And one thing which makes me sure that that was the case, I remember the very first piece of mail I got as president was a letter from J. Edgar Hoover. A very thick envelope. It was marked top secret, eyes only for the president. And so I slit the thing open. I said, what in the world is this? And it was an intelligence report on a wiretap on Henry Brandon. Well, I knew Henry Brandon. He was still is, I think, a reporter for the London Times, very distinguished, very respected. And so I called Hoover and I says, what the hell is this? He said, oh, Henry Brandon, oh yeah, he's a British agent. I didn't know what we were tapping a British agent for. So I just took the envelope, threw it in the outbox, marked it for Kissinger. I said, look into this. I don't know anything about it. Never heard of it since. I'm sure Brandon thinks I put the tap on. But apparently Johnson had it on all the time. Maybe it was put on even before that time. What I am saying is that he felt that Hoover was indispensable in order for him to find out who his friends were and who his enemies were.
Did that go beyond the proper purview of an FBI director? Tapping potential agents is one thing, but wasn't he, as you describe it, in effect doing political intelligence for a president?
That's right. But Johnson was not telling me, I don't think, that Hoover was indispensable to him because of political intelligence. Johnson was speaking to me with regard to the narrow national security thing. I don't think Johnson would have wanted me to know that he had used Hoover to tap Goldwater or whatever they did do, or to use Hoover, as I have learned since, to tap my plane, to do some surveillance on Agnew in the 1968 campaign. That was a totally improper use of power.
Do you resent it?
No.
Why
don't.
not?
Because I would expect Johnson to do that.
Do you think, or do you know whether J. Edgar Hoover was a homosexual?
I don't know. I don't think so. No, I'm not. I can't say that I'm a judge on this, and naturally I don't know. I have no experience to know whether he was or he wasn't. But I would say that I discount it all because that is such a typical line of the left, to attack anybody on the other side on sexuality, on drunkenness, on drugs, and so forth and so on. In other words, they're attacking those on the other side for what they themselves do. And I would say that as far as J. Edgar Hoover, he was one of the most virile, strong men I ever saw. As a matter of fact, he had a lot of pretty girls pictured on his wall and so forth and so on.
Are you aware that the most recent and in some ways the most definitive person to put this into print is John Ehrlichman?
Well, I wouldn't think that would be a very good source because Ehrlichman had a thing against Hoover. So
How did Lyndon Johnson came to the Congress in the early 40s? He was a poor boy from a hardscrabble part of Texas. He then continued in Congress as vice president, as president, and when he returned to Texas, when he died, he left a fortune that's been estimated between $14 and $20 million. How did he do that?
well, he had television station to begin with, and I think he made some very good investments, let's put it that way. I am not one to sit here and try to judge what he did. I haven't looked into the facts. Many who have looked into it have concluded that he did use the power of his office in terms of getting his television license, in terms of getting information with regard to a good land deal or here, there, or the other place. But let's just say that everybody should judge for himself after doing a thorough study. I don't intend to look into it. Johnson has served his country. The time is over now, and I'm going to judge him on his record and not on what he did in that area.
Is it true that there was not a different kind of morality, but a different kind of standard applied to those kinds of activities, certainly before Watergate, but probably even before television journalism, that congressmen and senators kept up ties with law firms, that they received gifts from constituents, they got involved in deals, they got tips and that kind of thing, so that it was a real different, it's apples and oranges to compare.
I agree. I think that's the case. And incidentally, it was on the Republican side too. Some of them had some pretty good sweetheart deals. And there were some Republicans, more Democrats, I must say. Doesn't mean that it's all the hanky-pankies on one side. But I would say that in terms of coming into office and coming out richer, there were some Republicans that did and a number of Democrats as well. Johnson was in that group. Not that it makes me any more moral, it's just that my interests were another direction. I think I'm one of the few that came out of office without having profited from it. But I've done very well since.
I'm sorry to say that in order to record our birthday greetings, we got to cut off now. However, it's a good point because next day we'll just pick up with the assessment of Johnson. I saved the assessment of Kennedy because I figured you'd want those two chunks. And then we'll do de Gaulle and we'll do some pickups and the comeback.
Let's see, did we see what we missed on Johnson? I'll check. I'll give you 2 or 3 lines that I think are particularly good out of your briefing if I think we missed them. Okay. You can pick them up very easily.
What about there are a couple of Yes. Do you want me off?
I just love that bumblebee story that you put.
And true.
I added the ass to it. You didn't have that in there. It'll be better on the ass.
History will never know because we'll never tell.